Hey, it's Silken Laumann joining everybody today for our Facebook Live talk. We've got a great guest today, Lynn Keane. But before introducing Lynn Keane, I wanted to introduce you to my new puppy. Those of you who've been following me since the beginning of COVID, remember that my beautiful golden blue died the day we launched Unsinkable Youth, which was super, super sad. But Rosie was born the same week, and she is now going to be my little comfort dog when I'm doing Facebook Live. So I want to introduce her. She's getting a little squirmy. Say hi to everybody. So that's our first special guest, but we have another special guest today. I want to introduce Lynn Keane. Lynn Keane is a former broadcaster. She has, for the last 20 years, been a huge advocate in the area of mental health and suicide prevention, helping and encouraging others to get help as needed to become educated about mental health and suicide. She's a speaker, she's a writer, she is just an amazing champion of others. She came on board with Unsinkable, offered her story to us from the very, very beginning. And the thing about Lynn is she always asks, how can I help you? And she's just one of the most generous and open-hearted person that I know, people that I know. And so I'm so grateful to have her here today. But before we introduce you to Lynn, or Lynn comes on, I wanted to play a video that Lynn did for us. Again, at Unsinkable and Unsinkable Youth, we are a not-for-profit. We told her about our mission and what we were trying to do around empowering and educating others around their mental health, empowering everybody to share their stories and to share sort of that lived experience and knowledge so that we can help others along their journey. And Lynn has a very personal story to share with us today, but let's watch her intro first.
He's perfect. I promise to always look after you. You can do anything when you set your mind to it. Something's not right. Is something going on? Are you doing okay? You've got so much to look forward to. It's going to be okay, I promise. I can't wait to see you at Christmas. We can try to figure out what's going on together. He's lost weight. He says he's not sleeping. He's changed. He's not engaged in the things he used to enjoy. I think he's self-medicating. He never wants to disappoint us. Daniel's not answering his phone. Where is he? Please call us as soon as you get there. We're scared, Daniel. We love you. Is this how you felt every day? Sad? Empty? Lonely? There is no shame. There was only ever love. I started running again. I'm moving forward, keeping your life and our memories close.
Lynn, one of the things about our site is that we share our stories, and sometimes we make ourselves very vulnerable. And I think in this video, I haven't been able to watch it without crying. It's your story about losing your son, Daniel. And as sad as it is, it's also meant to give people hope and to open the doors around this thing that we don't talk enough about, and that's suicide, the loss of our children. It's one of those subjects that is so painful and so unthinkable for most of us that we don't have that conversation. So first of all, thank you for sharing that with Unsinkable. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for doing that video. You're an amazing woman. And you've taken your grief and your sorrow over something that most people don't think they can get through. When we think of the worst things that life can give us, I think losing a child is right up there with it. So I wanted to know if you could start today by telling us a little bit about Daniel, your beautiful boy, and maybe taking us along the journey a little bit about not only losing him, but how that fired up your advocacy work.
Thank you, Silken. Thanks for the opportunity, and just to be part of Unsinkable in any role. Just it's such an important platform for all of us Canadians to be able to have a space to be vulnerable and be truthful with our pain, which took me a long time to do in our circumstance. But yes, what can I say? He was just, in my eyes, just one of the most loving, beautiful boys. Daniel was always the fixer too in our family. He was the oldest, and so we sort of leaned on him for lots of different things. And certainly the tech, he helped us with our tech issues, and he was the one that put up Christmas lights. But beyond that, he would sit with you when he would see me heading out the door to do a run or something, and he'd see something in me and say, "Mom, why don't you just sit back and just hang out with me for a bit? Do you have to go out today?" And he was just a very sensitive soul. And oftentimes I did stop and listen and just sit down and we'd chat. And Daniel grew up with health conditions. A lot of kids do, and they overcome it. And he did. He had asthma and anaphylaxis. But the second piece, the anaphylaxis sort of put him in a position where a lot of foods could actually kill him. So he from a very young age sort of looked at the world sort of looking in, and it sort of created an anxiety and stress that really, when he went away to university, really was exacerbated. But sort of in the meantime, I mean, he'd grown into being this great chef, and he could create these great meals. But at the same time, he couldn't just be like his buddies and just go to a shop and just eat pizza or eat burgers or whatever that looked like. So that was sort of and I think also some of those asthmatic events that he had as a very, very young child sort of set him up to not necessarily to be fearful, but to have these sort of early life negative experiences that research shows that can have an impact on a young person's mental health as they grow up. So we really weren't privy to that kind of information at the time. As he was growing up, it was more how to keep your child safe from offending foods and not have an asthma flare up.
Sorry, Lynn, it's interesting because Daniel died 11 years ago. He was 21 or
23.
23. But there's so much more information out there now about trauma and depression. But at the time, 11 years ago, I mean, we didn't even talk about depression in young people.
Absolutely. And, I write a lot about having those conversations with your kids. And, it sounds easy, but it's not always easy to sit and sort of see behavioral changes and ascribe them to just growing up. But we have to pick that apart and just, sit with them and say, we've noticed this. Where can I be of support, or where can I be of service? We took the approach of, because Daniel was, he could do so many things. We'd say, you can do anything you want if you just set your mind to it. Well, when your mind is not functioning the way the way it should, you can't just get your life together. So yeah. One of the things that I'll always struggle with is, as close as we were and are as a family, we were collectively unable to support him when he was fighting to live. And I think that was sort of the springboard for me after losing Daniel. I'm springing ahead a bit just to kind of, put this in perspective. When we lost Daniel, I think it was first of all important for me to understand and accept our own reality. But once I started to learn more, that was the springboard for advocacy, because I was completely shocked at the things that were happening in front of us that we couldn't ascribe to a catastrophic depression that could lead to someone taking their life.
So I know that there's parents listening today, and as you know, Lynn, I'm the parent of 4 kids from the ages of 19 to 24, and the teen years, those early adult years are actually really tough years, and it's kids can be very private at that time, and and they show they show so many signals of odd odd behavior, right? They change so much in those years. So what are some things now, knowing what you know? Because again, I know other people are listening today and are afraid for their own kids, or maybe seeing some things in their own kids and are like, is this a warning sign? Maybe you can share some of those in the years that you've been doing this thinking and this working, that we might look out for in our kids.
I think you're right. The tween years are really, there's just a combination of emotions. And when you're in a house of teenagers, you're just like, you're trying, who needs me the most, today. But I think with Daniel, because he was the oldest, and again, we talked often, about his allergies and other things. And he would always say, "Mom, I'm fine." But when I started to hear, when I reached out to him and I said, like, you seem sad. Like, you just don't seem like Daniel. You're not golfing anymore. You're not really shooting hoops with your buddies. What's changing? Again, because I didn't have that background information and education around things that were changing and I was actually seeing, I couldn't, draw a straight line from stopping activities, but that is clearly one of the signals. Not going to school. Again, we were not aware that he had actually left university, because again, when you're in those states, you're not that you become good, but he became aware of what he wanted to show to us, and then the reality of what he'd go back to Waterloo and actually not be in school. So the knowledge that your young person is actually not attending class regularly, because universities and colleges and any post-secondary don't really have to share that information with family. That I wish really would change, because that certainly could have been one marker to help us. Daniel had lost weight over a period of probably 5-6 months, dramatic weight. And I could see sort of his belt buckle was sort of hanging down. And I'd say, like, how are you losing weight? I'm not eating as much as I used to. I'm trying to do this. So he'd always have something to tell me to kind of placate me, because he knew me. And I think one of the biggest things, though, when your family member, and especially your young person, isn't sleeping through the night, or they've got their cell phone on, or they've got their computer on for a light or something in their room, that's a huge marker. Not being able to sleep is a really big sign for all of us, really, that we're possibly trying to process things and dealing with things. So if you add up losing weight, other things where he'd not show up for family events. He said he would, and then at the very last moment he'd sort of check out and say, got to work on a project. These things were sort of adding up. Then his literal behavior was changing in front of us. And that was really where he became very argumentative, very agitated very quickly. He would literally come home. He'd make this grand meal for all of us. We'd all sort of help him prepare in the kitchen. But by Sunday afternoon, when he was heading back to school, you could just see the darkness taking over him. Mm-hmm. But when you don't understand what that looks like for somebody, it's really hard to help them. So
it's really hard to help them. And, it's, of course, you've had all this time and all this knowledge now to look back, right? But the truth is, most of us wouldn't catch it in our kids. It's really, really hard. And kind of like you said earlier, you had a house full of kids, like, who needs me first? All young people have these ranges of behavior, right? So like being able to discern, okay, what is worrisome? So you've given us some clues, when your kids aren't sleeping, when they're not eating, when you've noticed that they've lost weight, what strikes me, you had a very open dialogue. Even 11 years ago, when nobody was talking about mental health, you were having a very open dialogue, and yet still, Daniel wasn't able to come and say, and maybe he didn't even recognize the depth to which he was struggling. And it's something like, as a full-grown adult, I can really relate to. Like, when I was a young person, I had thoughts of suicide, and I engaged in self-harm. And it was only until much, much later in my life, like I'm talking my 40s, Lynn, that I recognized, no, like, actually that was and is now depression. And it's a medical condition. And there are actual things that you can do to help, because that's a big one too. Like when you're 20 years old, when you're 18 years old, you don't think anything's going to help, right? You don't have any like wisdom or perspective or experience to say, no, these things can make a big difference. And I just think 11 years ago, we were just that much further behind in our knowledge.
So behind. And I think, like, as I said before, I think that was the impetus to find out, to understand our own reality. But then I thought, we're not talking about this. But just to sort of go back, just to sort of put another point, I remember reading very early on an author, Thomas Joyner, who had lost his father to suicide. He's a researcher and suicidologist. And his book is really clear about fearlessness, a sense of hopelessness, and a sense of becoming a burden. When you put those three sort of very strong emotions together, they are basically set a person up for a catastrophic event: self-harm, suicidal ideation, and completion of suicide. Again, like, I'd say hope. When you can look in the eye of someone you love and you can see that there's the hope, there's no hope there. There's something has been lost. You got to take them by the hand and just, we are so much more armed with awareness and with real time skills. Access to care is still abysmal in this country. Rates of suicide are spiking again, and particularly in our Indigenous communities. But what we do know now, if you are a parent at home and if you have concerns, at the very least, you have tools to go online. You can follow up. But I would say the medical profession, and I mean, suicide prevention right now in a time of COVID it's really up to us to be the gatekeepers, because they don't necessarily have time for us. Our doctors, our first line caregivers, they are so inundated. They're not really seeing us unless there's an emergency. And I would urge all parents to just to have like a very basic information, knowledge about what does mental illness, and there's so many different kinds of disorders. They could be anxiety, they could be full-blown depression, self-harm, cutting, things like that. Just have an understanding. And so many of the organizations, Canadian Mental Health Association, CAMH, they have really good tools, jack.org.
Yeah.
Just arm yourself with some information, and then it gives you a better point to actually approach your loved one.
Yeah, that's very powerful. Thank you, Lynn, for mentioning that. And Phil, who's helping us with this show today, perhaps he can put up the information for Kids Help Phone, for jack.org, for CAMH, because there is a lot of information on the websites. And, I think one of the things with our kids, Lynn, is that, sometimes, when they tell us the truth, when they tell us what's happening, it's scary for us, right? Because we don't know what to do with it. So you actually had a very open relationship with all your kids. Not every parent does, and not every parent has those skills, that sort of social intelligence, and they struggle with it, right? And so that's where these other tools become so important. You have a very high emotional intelligence. I have a very high emotional intelligence, but even still, it can be very difficult to talk about those things. And one of the things I love is that you were able to say, because I think with the teen years, a lot of times cutting through the bullshit and cutting through all the things that they're saying and just actually observing and saying, hey, I know that you're sad. And just being able to say it, and like, because you do know your kids, you see your kids, and they're telling you all these things because they're 17, 18, 19, but what you're actually not to shy away from that, I guess is what I'm saying, because like, we're so afraid. I know I'm afraid with my kids of saying things that are going to piss them off, that are going to, create a reaction that's going to create, especially with a lot of kids in the house. Sometimes you're just like trying to keep the peace between kids, and you're not talking about what you're seeing. And I think that's another part of all of this with our kids, is being able to actually be honest and show them that we see them. because they can be us, everybody else, but and they can us too. But when we see it, to speak it, and then, like you said, there are these resources out there, and that's what we're always saying in the area of mental health is like reach out for help. I wanted to touch a little bit about some of the barriers, because you talk a lot about suicide prevention and the signs to look for with your kids. But what are some of the barriers, and particularly I think what's for people of color, for young people? We know, and you sent me this great article before our interview today about the rate of suicide, particularly in Black youth, being like 78% higher than it was like 15, 16 years ago, where it's been stable in other populations. So what are the barriers, like just generally, and maybe unique to that population?
So the more reading I'm doing, I'm learning a lot, like you, in terms of for people of color. I mean, we are a biracial family, and this, for all intents and purposes, Daniel grew up in a white society, we'll say. But if I sort of put that in another place, and I look at Black youth, I mean, they have trauma in at writ large, just because of growing up Black in America. They look at things, they look at being afraid of law enforcement. They look at what their parents have had to go through. They look at poverty. Also, in just culturally, it's not something that's been talked about a lot. It's not something that you want to own. And I mean, I think that's sort of mental illness across the board, but in the African community, the Black community in the US, it's not a topic of conversation. And, maybe part and part of, you go to church, and, you go to church on Sunday, and that's where you pray, and you that's how you'll work through it. Or I can't speak to that because I don't live there, but just from reading, I think if you look at and sort of the exposure that my father would have had growing up in Philadelphia as a young Black youth, it's tough. And so the access just from being traumatized, you have a higher incidence of probably having some sort of mental health condition as you grow up. And then you add just no healthcare or lack of healthcare for mental health, preventative healthcare across the board. And then you look at means. Just generally in America, there is greater means in terms of the guns. And so there's so many more things. And then you look at
layers and layers of it, isn't there?
Layers of it. And it's also hundreds of years of being devalued and being dehumanized culturally, that you really have to be somebody that can break through that and have such great supports on hand throughout your life and mentors to really break through that. And that's it's really difficult for youth in the African American community, unless, as I said, you've got a really strong foundation that can sort of see what's going on, just like all of us. But again, there's just that many more layers for a young Black youth dealing with a mental health condition.
Well, I think clearly the numbers are telling us that we have to do different, and we have to do better. And I think because of George Floyd's death and all the things that have been happening in the media and all the activism that's been happening lately, we're all trying to educate ourselves and try to understand what the experience is. And like you said earlier, trauma is a huge indicator of how your mental health is going to turn out long term. Trauma, depression, anxiety all come from all connected, okay. Right? And so when you look at a section of people, a sector of people who've had intergenerational trauma. So I know just from my own little story and the trauma that I've had and my grandfather had, and like that there's unless you consciously are able to break the cycle.
Right.
And that takes, like you said, a huge amount of support, a huge amount of will, and some, individual resiliency. And like, how do you build resiliency?
Yeah. Yeah.
We know that we build resiliency by support and love and caring and having tools around us that help us develop hope and that ability to get up every time we're knocked back.
I think the whole thing about resilience is where does it begin? And we say, oh, that person was such a strong person, but there had to be a point where that person was, down, or something had happened or whatever in their life, and they had something that helped build them up, whatever that was. And I think those are the things that as parents we do kind of like we try to do naturally, if we can support our kids that way. And I think resiliency is sort of built upon rocks of other, like it continues to build. And but the other side of it is, when I look at my own sort of experience, just sort of stepping into sort of that whole identifying as a person of color in Canada, for many years, probably not until this spring, have I really thought about the things that I've experienced. And really, maybe they were the seeds of creating some sort of strength within me, and I'm sure they are. But I really never acknowledged a lot of the experiences, because a lot of them were very subversive, very sort of, from a little kid, you would sort of be just looked at as different. And you'd see adults would sort of not necessarily devalue you, but you knew you were being treated somewhat differently. So you kind of just assumed that was normal. And then but to seeing an epithet on your door, okay, this is not good.
You shared that story. I think, I was really saddened to hear about the experience that you had just written about recently about your mom in the mall, but also that terrible things that happened when you were pretty little, and that they're all kind of coming back to you now.
Yeah, and I think in some ways I feel incredibly empowered at this time of my life, which is, and I think why I feel like there's so much more to give and so many more people to support, and I feel, because I'm starting to process the things that I've addressed, or I'm starting to address, those sort of covert and then very overt, things that I would be with my 3 kids, and we'd be walking, or we'd be in an elevator, and someone would say, oh, it must be nice to be able to look after these children. And I'm like, well, yeah, it is, because they're my kids, and you maybe want to get off this elevator, because it's just, you cannot.
But could you say anything in that moment? Could you say anything in that moment? Probably not, right? It's just like,
no, I said, you better get off the elevator. I was like, no, because I think you come to points where you kind of just, you sort of absorb other people's basically misinformation and other people's ignorance. Because I don't always think it's coming from a place of meanness or, hate and racism, but people's ignorance can be just as harmful sometimes. And I literally told her she better get off the elevator, because obviously she recognized it. And I think with my younger daughter, Emily, we were fortunate to be in a protest this spring. And I remember we were finishing the protest, and we were sort of looking up at a bridge, and there were people all standing on the bridge, and all at once we all took a knee, and there was this.
Right. This was in Oakville, Ontario.
Oakville, Ontario.
Hard to even imagine a protest in Oakville, Ontario. I grew up in Mississauga.
There you go. And but there's the beauty. And my 89-year-old dad, who'll be 89 tomorrow, said, that is the beauty. And that is all of us coming together, regardless of what we look like, regardless of our experiences. He is seeing in this moment that people of all faiths, all color, are coming together and actually taking action. And I when I think of those people on the bridge that day and us walking, there's maybe a third of us that were people of color. The rest were white. But it didn't matter. We were all there because we knew that this was important and the right thing to do. And I finally feel at this moment in my life that I can call out things now and I just have such a strength that it's a muscle that I hadn't used in a long time. So I feel like this moment, this movement, this revolution won't end. And I think it's just going to continue and gather strength.
No, I agree, absolutely. And I pray for that. And, I think as a white person who has not experienced racism in any way, shape, or form, understanding my own ignorance and the assumptions I could have made in my lifetime is pretty humbling, and I think like a lot of other people, I'm almost become like afraid to say the wrong thing. But I've also been encouraged by people like you and others who are saying, well, let's have this dialogue. Like we actually, the worst thing we can do is not talk about it. So if you're coming from the right place, you might say the wrong thing sometimes, right? And but let's have a conversation about how this looks and how it feels like, and then over time how things can be different. One of the things that really hit me in one of the pieces that you did when you said being racialized makes you a target of another person's ignorance, and how you become so tired of absorbing everybody's assumptions, like that woman in the elevator, like we talk privately about you going into a restaurant and with your husband who is white, and people trying to put it together, and it made me think in my own mind, okay, have I ever done that? Like what stories do I tell myself when a Black woman and a white man come into your restaurant with white, or just question everything and realize how many layers of assumptions you are making, and really want to stop that and become educated and to do a lot of listening.
Yeah. I would say I'm listening. I'm trying to understand what other people have, what others' experiences are as well, because I think it's just the more we all understand together. But I think the thing that I think is really sort of seminal for me is growing up as like a little Black girl in Toronto, and then biracial girl, and then I think as I grew up into a young woman, what really hit me is how Black women are treated. If we look at sort of, there's the white male, the white female, the Black male, and then the Black female is sort of at the bottom of sort of humanity in some regards. And particularly Black women have been basically dehumanized and then like sexualized and objectified. And I think we shouldn't have to be concerned about how we present to the world. We should just be able to present the way we naturally present and be okay with that. And, sort of I look at it as just kind of maybe I can use my hair as an analogy. I have curly hair, and it's, sometimes it's really frizzy. Sometimes I get it blown out. But it's the times that I get it blown out that I get the nice comments, right? And I'm thinking, was it not nice when it's curly? But it's just this assumptions, and just get the fact that the way we present to the world is the way we want to present to the world, and be okay with that. And we don't have to make commentary on it. And I think that would be something that I would say would help us is, I'm not saying you don't make comments or say something, I love this, but think about what you're going to say, because a lot of it can be attached or ascribed to your cultural background, and it may not be okay.
Yeah. That's a good one. And just what you said earlier, like we need a whole lot more of just being like, even beyond racial differences, we need a whole lot more of being able to present ourselves more authentically as we are, come as you are. One of our young Unsinkable youth interviewers were saying the other day, and I thought, wow, what a beautiful idea, right? That we actually come not as a Black woman or a white woman or a woman or a man or somebody who's fitting into society's idea of beautiful or glamorous, or somebody who doesn't, and just to come and to be who we are as we are. I mean, ultimately, I guess that's a little idealistic, but wouldn't that be a much better world? And the other thing that really has struck me, like kind of going on a little bit, not on a tangent, but it's, about how we identify. Somebody said that we identify a person by their race first. Actually, okay, so it was because I'm training my dog. Okay, that's a terrible analogy in some ways, but they say dogs they feel energy, right? And then he said, well, of course, like in humans like identify first by race. Yeah. And it made me think, I'm like, you know what? He's totally right. How often we say, oh, there's this Mexican guy, or, there's this woman from China, or like, and it's like, why is that? You know, the same way I ask myself with a lot of transgender stuff, and I ask myself, why is it so important when a baby's born that we know whether it's a boy or a girl?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why is that even that? Like, it's just like the first thing. We don't ask, like, does she have 10 toes or 10? We ask, is it a boy or a girl? Right? I do it. And why is it the first thing that we think of and we see? Color. It's interesting.
And you know, I grew up in the school of, I grew up in Toronto, and there was a real sort of melting pot of races and faiths. And as kids in that era, we really just didn't identify as anything other than we were kids. You know, there were name calling, but again, it was just, it wasn't hurtful, so to speak. And I think I kind of grew up with that, not necessarily seeing color or seeing your political stripe, or like, I just saw you for who you were. But I recognize that we're at a moment where we actually have to kind of go backwards and identify to understand what has not happened for people of color, Black people. And I think that's where we are now.
Yeah, and you say that, and I certainly that was your experience, but you also had these experiences, like you said, somebody spray painting your door, and going to the mall with your mom who was white, with, you know, and then a coworker seeing her with you and the kids, and then not having a job on Monday morning.
Yeah.
So how did you disseminate those experiences?
Well, I mean, I get, when I was, you know, these are things that my mom has been sharing with me. Well, I mean, the epithet on our door probably was the first reckoning of, we are different. Our family is different, because why would they write that word on our door? And, you know, if you go to my post on Instagram, I've been very clear about what it is. And it just, my brother was older, but I was kind of traumatized. I was afraid to be in the apartment. I was afraid to go into the apartment and stay there, because I thought people were coming again. And in terms of my mom, with her, when she lost her job, she just recently shared that with me, actually, through this movement. And so we've had lots of conversations of what my mom has experienced as a white woman marrying a Black man. And, you know, basically she shed her privilege when she married my dad. And, you know, is she stronger for it? Obviously, but things that she's had to endure that I haven't even, and she's a white woman. You know, they lived in Philadelphia for a time, or New Jersey for a time, and the treatment that you just can't understand it. And I think a lot for my parents, I think it was for them, they had seen so much hurt and so much lack of humanity, that they thought that they would come back to Canada, and it was different for sure for both of them. And I was born here, so that's really all I know from my experiences. But my dad was a Black ball player, a semi-pro ball player, and he would travel north and south. And
so cool.
The north was better than the south. And you know, he couldn't go into certain restaurants, and they couldn't eat in, you know, white or segregated areas. But again, I take such comfort in, when I look at my dad and all of his experiences and his age, he's seen a lot. And for him not to be bitter, to me, it says we have a lot of work to do, but it's certainly worth doing, because if I see hope in him.
Yeah, the hope, and he has a remarkable story of being a professional athlete in a time where there was still segregation, and like coming north. And you know, it's great that we are doing better, but we're still so far from doing good enough, right? And you know, we talked let's get back a little bit to resiliency, because I think about your dad, and I think, okay, well, you know, and I certainly do this, like with my parents. I go, okay, like they lived through the war, and and they had this trauma and that trauma, and my trauma is not that bad, because like they've done so much better than their parents did, and their parents before them. I mean, do you think some of that resiliency that you have, which you know, going through what you did as a family and have as a family, losing Daniel, and finding the courage to speak so openly, and what I love about what you're doing is that you still allow yourself to be vulnerable and to touch the pain. So you haven't just like pushed it behind you and like moved on to this new path. You've allowed that pain to inform the work that you do today around suicide prevention and awareness. So do you think that you know, the parents that you had and the experiences that they had have in some way equipped you with the resilience that you needed to go through some of the things you have since then?
Absolutely. I mean, exactly what you've said. I think as we're growing up and we're even adults, we don't always know the lessons that we've picked up, sort of innate lessons. And I think watching my parents, not necessarily their struggles, but watching the things that they've experienced and how they've come through so many things, and who they are today, as seniors who aren't really seniors, because they're just kind of very vibrant, very active, and they're very clear on what they experienced and what it could have done to them. Mm-hmm. And I think that sort of took me to a place that I didn't know I'd ever have to. I think I'll go back and say, I think we're all born with this reservoir of strength. And I don't think we necessarily have to tap into it because I first of all believe we're all touched by something in life, and we all have our struggles, and your worst struggle is your worst struggle, and it's not to be compared to anybody's. And I do believe that when we are pushed in life, we will find that reservoir and we will keep digging, and there is something there that is beyond our, basically we all have to, there'll be a time when we have to live life at a different level. And it's a question of if we can. And I think it's seeking that first, living with the grief. And I would say, if I look at the resiliency, it sort of brought me to where I was in losing Daniel, and then sort of reflecting and living in the grief world for several years before I could really kind of come out again and share in the way that I've been able to share. Those foundational things that have happened to me and to my parents are all part of this legacy of strength that's been built within our family. But I think at the core of it is everybody who's touched by something so horrific as losing a child. Like that's sort of, I don't know that there's anything equal. I'm sure there may be to someone else, but for me, I ran away from the pain for a long time. Like I kept thinking, what's going to happen next? I was so afraid of what that next step of grief or that next feeling of grief. When I finally stopped running and allowed it to really take over me, I started to accept my loss. And then the acceptance was really the beginning of hope. But it's all little steps of sitting with the pain to it. And that is, I believe, what is the foundation for resilience, is just being okay. At some point, you're going to have to absorb it, and then finding ways to find hope and find meaning.
It's pretty profound, actually, Lynn, the idea that you can't run away from it, right? Like,
I tried. I did.
When I think about losing a child, I can't breathe.
Yeah,
right. And
exactly what happens.
You can't breathe, and you think you're not going to survive it. And what you're saying is that human beings have the capacity to get through anything. And of course we see this, we see it, but like we don't really believe it. And I mean, we talk a lot about that in mental health, right? About how you can't run away from your feelings. At some point you have to feel the feels, you have to feel whatever you're feeling. And often, like you say, it's the beginning of the acceptance. It's so painful, but it's less painful than avoiding the pain. Like eventually trying to avoid the pain becomes more painful than the pain itself. And the thing about young people in mental health is that they don't have that perspective. Right. So when we're talking about, kids, young people who are experiencing mental health issues, is that one, they don't have a perspective of an adult that, have been through a whole bunch of stuff and survived. Right. So they don't have that. They have all the hormones and all the changes that are happening as a young person that are hard to understand, even with, perfect mental health. And they don't know that things are going to be better. And sometimes I just feel like it's through the grace of God that any young person survives their late teen years and their tweens and their even their early 20s. It's there's still so much struggle, and that's why we just have to keep talking about it, don't we? And we have to share what works and what helps, and not allow any young person to feel that or to think whatever they're feeling doesn't have an avenue for support, doesn't have a way of getting through. Because that's the thing, like you talk about hope. At some point, Daniel lost hope. At some point, these kids lose hope. And how and what can we do to, as a society, as parents, to continue to give them some hope?
That's sort of the reality. And looking in the rearview mirror, in those last few days that we had together, if I think of Daniel, he was trying to stay another day, because he was reaching out to me in ways, again, looking back, that he hadn't before. I just couldn't connect the dots, but he had lost hope, but he was still trying to hang on. And I hear the words that he said to me, that he was talking about the future while being dragged down. And if I could have given him some perspective of, this sucks right now, this is like the worst, we are going to collectively get through this, because you mean everything to all of us. And I think that for every young person who is feeling bad and their mental health is messed up, and they've either got a diagnosed condition, or they're just mired in so many things. And this is not an easy world to live in. You matter so much. You have so much left to do. And I just didn't get to do that. I didn't get that conversation.
Well, yes. But the reality of illness and mental illness is that sometimes it's fatal, and you don't know when. And so on the one hand, I think in our podcast and in our conversation, we want to help people have hope, and we want to help people identify the signs. And yet we also recognize that sometimes mental health is fatal. Some mental illness is fatal. And sometimes we don't catch it, and we can't catch it, and we didn't figure it out. And I honestly mean it, Lynn. I feel like sometimes it's really through the grace of God that we do, that kids get through this, because there's so many ways that we can miss it, and that we can, and so I don't want to make everybody out there listening paranoid. Because I know sometimes that's how I react. When things happen with my kids, I just know so much that I feel so anxious and so paranoid, as they've had various struggles in their life. So that's not what I'm trying to do. But I think what we are trying to do is really raise awareness, really encourage. Like I would say to parents, the best thing you can do for your kids is work on yourself. Work on your own mental health. Go out. If you want your kids to go see a counselor, you go see a counselor too, right? Like it's not all their job. And chances are there's crap that you got to work out inside yourself and in your family dynamics anyhow, right? So, don't ask them to do something that you're not willing to do yourself. And just to kind of touch back, we've only got a few minutes left here. I just want to talk a little bit about this time in our lives. Lynn, you alluded to it. You feel so empowered at this particular juncture in your life. And I laugh when I hear that a little bit, because part of me is thinking, that's like when you cross that like 50, 55, barrier. I don't know, for a woman, it's like, look out world, because us women, it's like,
I'm over that barrier even.
Yeah, you're a few years ahead of me, and really paving the way for me. I'm looking at you going, okay, I need some of what she's got, because I'm on the right track, right? But like being in our 50s and early 60s, it's like, it can be a super liberating time if you've done that personal work, if you've lived with courage and continue to sort of take risks. I'm certainly finding it like the time of my life in terms of creativity and impact, and just having the energy. You talked about energy too. Like, you still have all this energy, partially because it sounds like you've done so much internal work.
And, I think Silken, 11 years ago, we'll say, is probably when I had to start looking inwards. And because for so many years we just sort of, we lived as a family of five, and we had this great life together, and we moved as a family of five. And then when the day that stopped, I had to face a new life, and it'll never be a new normal, because I don't, normal's when you have everybody together, and that will never happen. But I had to start looking inward. And I think it's been 11 years of internal excavation. And a really dear friend of ours, and I think I mentioned it earlier, said, you live life at a different level because you were forced to. And I really think that gives me wings sometimes to say, I can do this. I feel like I'm going to write this piece, and it's going to come, and it's going to take me a long time, but I feel that there's so much experience in there, and there's just so many layers of different things that you it's okay to go back and be vulnerable again. And I kind of go back and forth with being, open and vulnerable to, sort of not being, but it's been 11 years of work, and I think I'll just sort of mention this quickly, but before Daniel passed, several years before he passed, I started to dabble in triathlon, and he would joke, he said, well, you're not a swimmer, so like, that's not going to happen. Right? And so, the fact, and that's how we that was our roles together. It's like, he would always sort of make fun and push my buttons. And then I thought, well, no, I'm going to do this. And so hence I signed up to do this race in Ontario. And of course he passed that year, and I said, well, that's not happening. And then it was 2015, and I actually crossed the finish line of that race, and it was because of him. And I remember literally, figuratively, having my family there, and Daniel and I crossing together. So that,
well, you know what? I'm glad that you mentioned that, because it's really worth more than a mention, because you are a terrific Iron woman. You are really just an inspirational athlete, like, besides everything else that you do. And I see you as a Lululemon ambassador, and just like, wow, she is rocking it, man. Like, she's redefining what it is to enter your 60s. I love it. And I love that you're just you're so authentically who you are. It's really beautiful. It's very visible to me. I also know that like, sport itself, it's such an important part of my life. And none of the people who are listening today is going to be surprised by that. But like, it itself can be so healing. We talk a lot about that on our Unsinkable platform, not as much on our Unsinkable Youth. I'd like to bring more of that into it, is how healing movement can really be. Can you just talk just for a minute or two about, how training for that Ironman was actually part of your healing?
So 2018 or 2017, I decided that I was going to, bite off the full distance Ironman. And I was scared of open water and all these different things. It was really just starting to just break down all the fears. It was just like, what was the anxiety around open water? Well, you've been stuck in open water, and you panicked and you started to go down. So that's like, it's a real issue. It's a real fear I had to honor. But as I took each of the three sports, swim, bike, run, and broke down what created anxiety or stress, I just learned to kind of challenge myself and say, okay, well, that you're fine with open water now, so that's done. And it took time for each of these sort of parts to kind of fit together. And it took about 9 months of, horrendous training. But I'll tell you, on the day of the race, I think I trained myself into living in the moment. And the best mentors that I had around me said, have fun today. But if I tell you nothing else, don't move beyond what you're doing right in that moment. So when I hit the swim, thought about my family, thought about Daniel, but I just thought about being in the moment and being blessed to actually take the start line and be with all these people, and then get on your bike, and then, do the run, which was a marathon after. And it was just, I was absolutely in the moment. And I really think a lot of that was just that focused training, I had to spend a lot of time in my head. I had to, and where it comes back to healing is each step I took forward was an act of healing internally, healing my pain. I wasn't running from it anymore, but I was finding meaning in this world that I had found myself in, this very different world. And I could find joy and I could celebrate. And I think those are the things that we talk about being unsinkable. I mean, we will all have trauma, and it's you hope that you have support around you, but even in lieu of that, you have a reservoir, and we can get through the worst. But we just have to do the work.
Lynn, there's no better way to end our time today than those words, I think, because the idea that you can be presented with the worst, what everybody who has kids fears, the death of a child, and that, it took you on this journey, it's taking you on the journey, and that grief doesn't go away, but you still are able to be grateful, to experience joy, to have tremendous vibrancy and meaning in your life. That gives me a huge amount of hope, and I know everybody who's listening today is going to feel the same way. So, Lynn, thank you for being you. You're just a great, great woman, and you've been so generous to us at Unsinkable, and I'm so happy and grateful today that we could give you an opportunity to share and to inspire with your story. Lynn Keane, everybody, look her up. She's on Instagram and Twitter. Amazing woman. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Silken. Okay.